We're going to follow up on that presentation and great questions to the two presenters. I guess I just wanted to make one observation before starting the panel, which is to say, to reinforce the point that both Sam and Beth made, that this is really a start at a very, very big question. There's certainly limitations to the instrument that we have used, the methodology that we have used, and the number of respondents was rather small, so we can't really respond to questions about, you know, is the situation different in lower income versus middle income countries? Do data needs differ by the nature of the stakeholder? We can't really push too much in that direction. And we also, Sam mentioned the utility of this approach in terms of getting a cross-country evidence base on these types of questions. But on the other hand, we haven't done any focus group discussions, so we don't really know why people responded to the questions in the way they did. We can't really guess how they interpreted the question about accuracy, for example, that you asked about. So there's clearly more work to be done, and that's by way of inviting everybody to think about these questions, including starting with my wonderful panel. So let me just go ahead and introduce the panelists that we have this morning. I'm going to start with Shada. Shada Badi is the managing director of Open Data Watch. Open Data Watch is an NGO that is focused on monitoring open data and promoting use and impact of official statistics produced by governments around the world. She's been an active member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Group on Data Revolution. She co-chairs the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Data Network, and has played a key role with the startup of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And Shada brings decades of experience in managing global development statistics and was the longtime director and colleague at the World Bank of Development Data Group. I equate data at the World Bank with Shada's name. She was there for 30 years, I believe, if not more. Okay. And during her tenure there, she oversaw the publication of many World Bank statistical products, but perhaps the most impactful was her leadership of the World Bank's Open Data Initiative, which was a groundbreaking initiative at the time to provide full and free access to the World Bank's extensive statistical database. Dion Filmer, he's lead economist in the research group at the World Bank and co-director of the World Development Report, the most recent one, 2018, Learning to Realize Education's Promise. He also served previously as lead economist in the HD department of the Africa region. He works on issues of human capital, skills, service delivery, and the impact of policies and programs to improve human development outcomes. He's published widely, including in refereed journals, on a large number of topics, and I'll mention the 3 books to show you the range of his skills as a researcher. Making Schools Work, which is about accountability reforms, youth employment in sub-Saharan Africa, and From Mines and Wells to Well-Built Mines, turning sub-Saharan Africa's natural resource wealth into human capital. He's also a serial contributor to WDRs, having worked on the 1995 one on workers, the 2004 one on making services work for poor people, the 2017 on development and the next generation, and of course the most recent one. Nathaniel Heller at the end, not that you'll confuse him with Lisbeth, but he was appointed as the Results for Development Executive's Vice President for Integrated Strategies recently. And in that capacity, Nathaniel oversees the organization's practice areas that cut across disciplines, such as governance and citizen engagement, adaptive learning and evaluation, adapting and scaling up innovation, and initiatives aimed at increasing access to vital products or services in education, health, and nutrition. I read that and I said, well, that covers everything. What is it that you're not overseeing? Anyhow, previously he was managing director overseeing the organization's governance and social accountability program. Prior to joining R4D, Nathaniel co-founded and led Global Integrity, a nonprofit organization that promotes government transparency and accountability worldwide. During the same period, he designed and established Open Gov Hub and created an emerging markets research company and a software as a service research platform. There's more to be said, but please have a look at your, your write-up. And last but not least, Lisbeth Steer. She's the director for the Education Commission. And in this role, she led the report, The Learning Generation, Investing in Education for a Changing World. And now she's overseeing the implementation of the many recommendations that came from that commission report, including, but not limited to, the design of the International Finance Facility for Education. Before joining the commission, Lisbeth was a colleague, a fellow at the Center for Central Universal Education, and prior to that, director of the Overseas Development Institute's flagship program and development progress. Lisbeth has lived and worked in Southeast Asia for 10 years. I think that experience has inspired her and formed her to a large extent in terms of her interests. And she's written widely on the development finance and on education. So now, let's turn to our discussion. We already had a number of good comments, so having heard this presentation on our recent report, just to sum it up, we look at how data and information are used to drive decisions in the education sector. And I think the main takeaways are that there are gaps, sometimes large, between data availability and use, and between evidence and practice. And that while data play a role in informing decisions in the education sector and of education actors, there are many other factors that shape programs, policies, and investments. So let's just dig a little bit deeper and hear different voices from the panel on these questions. So I'm going to start with Lisbeth. Lisbeth, the report emphasizes, and I think you heard it in the presentations today, the importance of using data and evidence over producing data and evidence. But we certainly should not give the impression that we have enough of either. And the learning generation reiterated the high-level panel's call for a data revolution. Can you talk about what you had in mind when you made that call? And also, as you've gone around, both in the writing of the report and now the implementation of the recommendations, in your conversations with officials and policymakers, what comes up as the particularly important pieces of data and evidence that are missing? We did ask a question and got some responses in our panel, but I'd be interested in hearing if we can corroborate or enrich that feedback from the people with whom you've been discussing this question.
Great, thank you, Tamar. And it's great to be back here again with old friends and colleagues. I also had a sense when we were hearing the presentation today that there's sort of this feeling that we've got a lot of data already and we should really be focusing on the use of it. And I think we should challenge that a bit because what we found, at least, and I think this was also mentioned, but maybe less strongly in the report, there are still various areas where data is missing. And while in some cases data is there in abundance, it's only in some countries and in some areas. I think you pointed out the availability of impact evaluations, where the large majority is actually in 10 countries and probably the most of them in India. So there is a concentration of a lot of data in a few places. I think that's the first issue. The second issue is still we don't actually have enough data, I would argue. I've had the luck and the privilege to also look at other sectors during my career, and today there are every day billions of data points collected about one thing, and I wonder whether you can guess what that is. It's trees. Trees around the world are being mapped at an intensity that satellites around the world are constantly getting data points. And those billions of data points are put together and put to use through partnerships with the private sector to manage forest coverage and deforestation. So I always challenge us when we talk about our own children, why are we putting ourselves at a standard that's a little bit lower than what we do with the trees, which we also love, obviously. But let me get to what we are missing. First of all, we've talked about this, and I think most of you in this room agree, the learning data is just not there yet. Only 50% of countries have national assessments, only 30% have participated in international assessments. When you look at the level of education, if you look at secondary education, only 7% of low-income countries participate or has secondary level learning assessments. So it's still very small, given that we really care about this. So first of all, we need to do something about this, and we need to do it fast, because we've set learning as a target for 2030. So we've only got 13 years left, and we've not even started measuring it properly. Secondly, a topic that's very close to my heart, which is finance. It's absolutely astonishing what we have in terms of data on finance. We struggled quite a bit with that as a commission on financing to try and come up with data on what countries are actually spending on education. That doesn't only cover public spending, but also private spending, international spending. Again, 50% of countries report on government expenditure, 30% report on household or private spending, 20 or 30 on international finance. So there's very limited data here compared to, I'll take another sector, health. Publishes national health accounts for 180 countries around the world. In education, we don't yet have it in maybe 10 or 15. Those kinds of accounts give a sort of comprehensive picture of what spending is in those sectors. So thirdly, I will mention another one which I find quite interesting, and that's something the Commission is also working on quite a bit. And Beth, who is part of our team, wasn't mentioned in your illustrious career overview, but you made an amazing contribution to the Learning Generation report, and one of those contributions was around the diversification of the education workforce. And here's a question: why are we in education obsessed with teachers? And are we not obsessed with the education workforce as a whole? Compare with health. Do we hear an obsession with doctors? Yeah, perhaps a bit. But the World Health Organization has mapped all the roles of the health sector and is tracking those across countries. And when Beth was trying to look into what's the ratio between teachers and the supporting roles, we only found about 4 countries around the world where actually we could compare education and health, where the education sector had collected data on the entirety of its workforce. And this is very important because countries like Finland, only 56% of the workforce are teachers. So we're missing an entire set of actors that is actually very important and that is critical to the success of our sector. So we are, as a Commission now, focusing on the diversification of the workforce and trying to look into what are these different roles and how could we manage and monitor them better. So here's my plea for a little more death by data.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Just a quick follow-up. I've heard you talk about the trees before, and that brings up the question of what is the potential for using sort of big data in the education sector? And I might come back to Shada and ask that question as well. But just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Is there scope for using big data more effectively, or even using it in the education sector?
Yeah, and I definitely think there is. I find it funny because sometimes when I mention this, and I feel quite passionate about this, people sort of say, oh yes, sure. I mean, are you going to be monitoring children with technology? Yes, we will. We actually had a commissioner who's now unfortunately retired, the chief of the UNICEF, was telling us about how there are now things that you can put on children's heads to actually kind of measure their brain capacity and their readiness to go to school. We actually have technology at our hands, and I think we aren't, as a sector, really committed to it yet. I think we sort of feel that's maybe not something we should be doing in education. So my plea would be, let's get much more creative with the use of data. And I think already it's happening a bit with mobile phone technology and sort of monitoring of what's happening in schools. But we need to do much, much more of that, in my view.
Thanks. Dion, so the World Development Report talks about the gap between what we know and what we do, and urges the education sector to act on evidence. That's sort of one of your 3 areas of recommendations. So what do you think is key to closing this gap between what we know and what we do in the education sector?
So thank you. Thanks for having me on the panel. Before that, just to compliment the team on what I thought was a very interesting and insightful report, and I actually wish we'd had this report kind of while we were writing the WDR, because there's a lot of evidence in the report that I think would have been useful to be able to bring out. But to your question, you're right, we did not do another systematic review because, as the report mentions, there's already been quite a few systematic reviews and actually reviews of those systematic reviews. So we thought that had been done. But what we thought we would do is look at what those reviews suggested could make a big difference to learning outcomes and where that differed the most from what we saw happening in practice. And that's why we honed in on things like teacher professional development done right, teaching to the level of the student, where we see often a big disconnect between what's being taught at the curriculum level and what students are able to absorb, at least some students in classrooms. Early child development, where the evidence is pretty overwhelming that you can make a big difference, but in practice, children's opportunity to participate remains very low in a number of countries. Even technology and inputs and how they can leverage the teaching and learning process and often don't, because they're either misused or inappropriate to the setting, or school management that fails to actually act on the teaching and learning process, or it doesn't have the right level, or fails to act on teaching and learning, and therefore doesn't have the impact. So we identify those areas, recognizing sort of what's been mentioned a little bit directly by Lisbeth and in the report as well, that there's still evidence is thin in a lot of areas. So we don't just want to be looking for the keys under the lamplight. We have to be able to step back and understand that there are areas that, maybe areas we don't even think of right now, where there might be new evidence to be generated. And the geographic spread of the evidence is, there's a great chart in the report that really sort of illustrates just how concentrated some of that evidence is. But coming around more directly to your question, I think I would argue that, and the WDR argues, that using evidence is fundamentally a political challenge. And it's very consistent with the way the report here was framed, which about the institutional context. But core to that, we argue in the report, is the politics of education and the politics of improving education outcomes and improving learning outcomes. In the language of the World Development Report, if there's not alignment towards learning, then we shouldn't be surprised that the best evidence isn't actually used to improve learning. And the case of teacher professional development is maybe a case in point where the evidence is overwhelming. Well, okay, there's very strong evidence that teacher professional development that works with teachers in classrooms, providing feedback to teachers about what they're doing, what's working, using peer networks or mentors to reinforce that over time, works at improving learning outcomes. Teacher professional development that we over again and that the World Bank has funded and governments have implemented over and over again is taking teachers out of a classroom, sending them away to a room like this, lecturing them for half a day or 2 days, and then sending them back to the classroom and hoping for a miracle, not paying attention to what's happened. So the disconnect between those two is pretty stark, and billions of dollars are being spent on that second approach. Why does that stay? Well, it's hard to do the former. You might have to concentrate your resources. You might not be able to reach every teacher. You're reaching fewer beneficiaries. There's fewer per diems flowing through the system. There's a lot of the political things that sustain that model as opposed to what might work, because not everybody's incentive is actually aligned towards improving learning for the greatest number of kids. So I think that's the fundamental issue. There's a couple of other issues, and I'm glad Elizabeth mentioned the term death by data. In one of the workshops we did in preparation for the WDR, Geeta Kindan had this great presentation about a state in India where literally there was death by data, in the sense that the demands on the service delivery units, the schools, to generate data and report on data were so overwhelming on them and on the system that couldn't use the data. So really, it was actually, and that was by design, because actually nobody wanted data to inform the system. The idea was to just saturate the system with data so nobody could use it. But that brings me sort of to another point that I wanted to make about information and the role of information and shifting that politics, which is actually something I didn't quite see coming out in this report, and I'd be curious maybe if there's a chance to hear your take on this, which is the potential for information to shift the education narrative within a country. And so, obviously the example is the PISA shock, where country after country we hear about, when the data comes out, it changes the nature of the discussion and it focuses the discussion on learning. We have an example in the World Development Report, which is about Tanzania, nothing to do with PISA, but various kinds of data, including the citizen-led assessments, their own school leaving exams, which were plummeting, creating a political debate within the country, and then sort of data on service delivery together really shifted the discussion, both the sort of policy-space discussion and then the political pressure that was put on leaders to launch an education reform. So there again, there's the role for data in a sort of a different way than managing and monitoring. It's more about the pressure, and that is on your slide. It is on your framework, but in the report I didn't see it elaborated on, and I'm curious as to whether that's has to do with the responses to the questions that you got from your survey or not. One other thing I think about, what was key to that is making learning the key objective, and I think that's where the two reports are really sort of so in sync. Is the role of information for making education systems about learning, and then everything else is sort of in support of that, is I think what information can perhaps be best used for. I think there is a sense that sometimes that comes across as sort of hopeless, is that what you're doing is you're showing that kids aren't learning. I think there we would argue that having data that show where you can intervene, how you can intervene, things about the proximate determinants of learning that can be affected in shorter periods of time is helpful to creating a sort of a more positive, proactive narrative for action. And then just a plug for the World Development Report, and I'll end there. I mean, information plays a role throughout the report, the World Development Report, where assessing learning to make it a serious goal is one of our key messages. And I would absolutely agree with Lisbeth that there's more data that need to be collected. I mean, the UIS, when they did their assessment recently or a couple of years ago now, on which countries had the data to monitor the SDGs for the end of primary and lower secondary level, only about 50 to 60% of countries had that data, and fewer still had the data to monitor over time. So we're far from being saturated with data in terms of overall learning levels. But also within a country, shining a light on low learning levels, exposing this hidden exclusion of low learning, we think is fundamental. And then, information for evidence as information, which relates to your question. And then information as a destabilizer. And then one other thing, which actually comes out of this report too, is information that's feeding back in real time for implementation of programs. And we argue in the World Development Report for these, we steal from this notion from others on iteration and adaptation, and the importance of data feeding those iterative and adaptive loops to actually not come with ready-made solutions, but sort of find solutions that work in a local context using data to refine those approaches. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dion. I mean, certainly the importance of information and data in terms of their shock value. We recognize that, but even that's sort of contingent upon a population who cares and understands what those low levels of education mean and how they compare to other countries. But even more difficult is having shocked the system then, and that gets to your comment about information about the proximate causes of the low outcomes that are actionable in nature, because quite often just data about how poorly students are learning doesn't really lead to any action because actors in the system don't know what to do about it and are paralyzed. And we do have the example of USER that has repeatedly been showing how poor the learning outcomes are with arguably little effect in terms of changing action on the ground. But you do mention in the WDR the example of the UK, because I think it's important to note that these are not issues specific to developing countries only, but developed countries are also struggling with the same types of questions. And I was struck by the example of the UK that you presented, where they've taken the signals and done something with it. Perhaps you can talk about that a little bit as to what went into a successful attempt at addressing the learning issues in that country.
But I think the critical point you make is that there does need to be some sort of a conducive environment. So I think we've all seen examples of when countries perform very poorly on a TIMSS or on a PISA, and I think there's an example in the report that was presented today. I mean, I've observed this in Indonesia, for example, where TIMSS after TIMSS, they perform very poorly. It doesn't really seem to make a dent in the political space. Although I would challenge a little bit the narrative around USER, because I know that's the story that people tell, oh, USER hasn't improved learning outcomes in India. But I having engaged in some policy discussions around the WDR, I think there's still people in India that don't actually see senior policymakers in India that don't actually see learning as the objective of education systems. So I don't think it's a failure for us to actually keep reminding people that that's the problem. That said, there have been moves within India to actually get more serious about measuring learning, using national assessments, make the national assessment more robust. So I think it takes a long time, and you're right, there's no clear evidence of sort of an impact per se. But I think there is a changing narrative, and it's actually far from succeeded. On the case of England, I can't claim to be an expert on that. As you know, WDR is a team effort, and that was not my expertise. But I think what's interesting about that case is, again, it sort of came at the right time for that country. There was a political alignment, a willingness for change. There had been the change in government. The data would be able to be used. It fit a sort of a new management sort of style where data were important. But then it was used effectively over time to kind of both motivate the change and monitor the change and sustain it. So I think it is a good example, and we were glad to be able to use it. Just one last thing, since you mentioned the UK. I'm very glad today that we haven't been talking about high-stakes testing. Because usually when we start talking about assessment, immediately somebody starts talking about high-stakes testing, how terrible that is and distortionary that is.
The questions are
We still have half an hour.
But I think, you know, I think actually these are two very separable issues, and I think it's good to keep them separate and have a conversation about information and data that's not about high-stakes accountability approaches. It's a different form of accountability.
Great. Nathaniel, we've been talking about the importance of the institutional context, political constraints that often decision-making in the education sector is a function of the politics in the country. Given your background working on these sets of issues and on governance in particular, so I wanted to ask you specifically that question. I'd say one of the contributions of this report is emphasizing this institutional context within which education actors sit and how each individual interacts within this context is important in terms of what data they demand and how they might act upon that data. So we make the point in the report that moving from data availability to use, data production has to take into account the specific needs, capacity, and resources of individuals that are called upon to use that data, as well as think about the power relationships and we talked about the prevailing culture around data. So I guess wanted to ask you how these points resonate with you as someone who has also worked across multiple sectors, and whether education is clearly a complex sector, a complex production function with lots of stakeholders involved, but just wondering if this finding holds across sectors or there's something uniquely difficult about the education sector.
Sure, that's a big, I think, single question. I'll try and unpack it a bit. I think the short answer is yes, but that's not terribly satisfying. Before I get there, just even though many have said it, huge thanks and congrats, and also thanks for being on this panel, but to Sam and Beth and Tamar and the teams. I mean, this is a really important piece of work, and when Sam and I were suffering a couple of years ago doing similar analysis in the governance space using this exact approach of a giant survey sample and then trying to drill down with these snap polls, I mean, it's hard, and it doesn't give you fully satisfactory answers, and I think the report does a good job of hedging where it should, but this is a really great start, so just kudos and congratulations. For those less familiar, I come from a nonprofit organization called Results for Development, which supports local change agents in low to middle income countries to strengthen health, education, and nutrition systems through a lot of applied research, technical support, service delivery support. And so, yeah, this is sort of the milieu in which we and a lot of us in this room swim, or trying to navigate sort of the realities and the politics and the randomness of reform efforts. And I think, you know, my kind of 2 cents reflection, as I said, is yes. Part of, I think, the frustration and the thirst that a lot of us have for seeing more and better data get used for smarter and more efficient decision making is rooted in our own expectations, which might be a bit too high. And I, you know, if you've spent time in government, and I much earlier in my career spent 3 years in the U.S. federal government, one of the things I learned there was that this myth of the policy-making moment is truly a myth. Like, it really never happens. There's not, it's like, oh, it's Wednesday at 2 o'clock, time to go make some policy. Let's get around a big white linen table and just do it in a 60-minute block. It never really happens. And it's much more of this organic, strange, accidental process at times, sometimes driven by crisis, sometimes driven by personalities. And I think when you sort of step back and if you sort of adopt that view of how policy actually gets made or doesn't get made, it starts to tell us a little bit more about where and whether data can fit in. And so, you know, to me, it boils down to sort of common sense of data as one potential powerful input to decision making and policy making, but it runs up against a lot of other competing influencers. So some of it's, quote, politics, even though that's a bit of a crutch and it means lots of things. Some of it's ideology, and especially in education, as folks have noted, this is a non-trivial variable that crops up time and again. Habit and inertia are big, again, common sense realities. You know, we've done it this way for 3 generations. I don't care what your data says. I'm just going to keep doing it. The shiny thing effect. You know, so somebody sees a TED Talk or a Bill and Melinda Gates letter, or what, and it's like, that's what we're doing for the next 3 years. And that's sometimes how things work. And then capacity, and I think the report does a nice job of calling this out through some of the respondent data. If you're on sort of the front lines of either making policy in quotes or trying to figure out resource allocation within a system, I mean, this is, I think as external actors, we gloss over this, but the reality of, well, fine, your data say, A, B, and C, but I don't have the money, the people, the skills to do this. I'm going to default to the least bad, alternative, which sometimes is kind of bad, but it might be the least bad choice. So just, again, I think the sort of demythologizing what policymaking actually might look like in the education sector, and then trying to be realistic about how we can leverage or insert data at key moments. And again, I think in some ways small data is more compelling than big data, really getting granular about data that can solve actual problems. And then lastly, I think when it comes to sort of, quote, politics and power dynamics in the political space for reform, the role of evidence translators looms really interestingly large. We're actually publishing some work in the next few months around this outside of education, but I think the lessons stick in a lot of sectors. And what comes out of that, and again, it's largely common sense, but it's rooted in some rigorous research, is that it's again rarely this situation where a think tank or a policy organization spits out a bunch of data and evidence and then it magically gets taken up into policy. There's all of these translators who sometimes are policymakers themselves, sometimes it's the data producers themselves, might be media, might be trade unions. Especially in education, we know teachers' unions play a massive role, positive and negative, in a lot of contexts. Anyway, so you have these translators who very much can radically shape the impact or not of data going into a decision-making process, and understanding their access, their perceived credibility or real credibility, their political skills or not for taking advantage of crises, et cetera. I think that's another factor that helps to explain sort of how one navigates the context. So unfortunately, I don't think there's a silver bullet to solving this, but I do think the report speaks really nicely to the role that contextual factors and political factors play. And last quick point, just to endorse the larger point here about the need for more data, which almost everyone has said, we've been, suffering around this as well, just on work we've done on early childhood workforce issues, again, which I think Dion alluded to briefly. Hugely important. I mean, there's like no data sort of anywhere, right? And so we're going out and spending money and time just fielding surveys just to answer foundational questions about the size of the workforce, and we have no idea really about the quality of the services delivered. And that's just one small slice of the education system in any given country. So, I mean, this does feel relative to other sectors, especially health. And if you look at the numbers on just public goods and research, the dollars spent, I mean, health's like 10x, right? Dollars that are spent. I mean, there's clearly a call to action here in this report to really get serious, make the investments, and to establish that baseline.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Your point about the information translators is an interesting one. We had focused on that on our earlier report on information accountability. This group of people that are called infomediaries in terms of providing accessible information to parents and communities and helping mobilize them to action. But it's also interesting to think about it in the context of policymakers and how you package information in accessible ways and timed well. Many years ago, I worked on China, and we used to produce lots of reports, and the critical factor in whether or not the report was going to find an audience, let's put aside the impact, was whether it got a sort of one-page summary prepared by someone within the bureaucracy to pass it on to high-level people. Okay, Shada. So we've discussed and noted the enhanced focus that the global community has seen on more data, in particular as a result of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you welcome. What would you like to see from global actors beyond this general call for more data? Data revolution, we need more data, more evidence. Do you agree with the premise of the report? And we've nuanced it a bit in the conversation, obviously, that the bigger challenge is really the use rather than the production of data. Do we need a shift in thinking more about who needs what data, when, to do what with? And is there a need for a new initiative to push this, a new platform? or do we already have sufficient number of actors operating in this domain, and it's a question of sort of changing emphasis to some extent?
How many hours do I have? Well, no, 5 minutes, okay. I'm going to talk fast. Well, first on the global actors and what do we need beyond that. Just wanted to first highlight that this 2017 or past 12, 15 months have been huge in terms of number of policy reports that have come out talking about data. You probably have seen the Data Revolution report that came out from Africa. CSIS had a Data Revolution report. The SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solution Network, had a very good report on counting on the world. And recently, the Development Cooperation report of the OECD had a Data for Development report. And so there's altogether over 1,000 pages to read. So, but I participated in many of these, and I just wanted to summarize that overall, what globally is being said is very much along what the report is saying is that, but highlighting a lot about the data gaps. So it doesn't put one against the other of the data gaps, whether against data use. So it's really, we really need both. We need to be able to pay attention to the whole slew of along the value chain of data, from data production to data dissemination to uptake of data for policy making, but eventually, as Beth said, for impact and being able to show the impact of data. So this is the sort of the new way that the data is being, the framework of data is being globally put together. But if I wanted more from the global decision makers, there would be three things. One would be that, first of all, at the national level, we really need to pay much more attention to data at national level because it's a crisis. Lots of times we try to solve data problems at the global level. G20 comes with a data gap thing, and so comes with another data gap issue. And, these general actors get together and come up with a database, and they think they've saved the day. But it's really not. It's much more for the national capacity building that we need to pay attention to. And for that, we need political attention. Political attention not to politicize the data, but really to agree for the politicians to come together that we need reform at the country level. Some of these reforms need really hard decisions. Some legal things have to change, statistics laws, some sort of maybe independence given to, in some countries, to statistical offices, maybe integration between ministries and national statistical offices to be much more reinforced for data interoperability. So that political buy-in at the national level is really key. The second thing is all about money. As a lot of you know me, I'm advocating for more financing, better financing for data. Right now, we don't really have enough money, and we are estimating what more we need. I won't take you to the numbers, except that only 0.3 of ODA goes to data. And all we're asking is go to around 0.45. And that's, what I'm talking about, the salary of 2 soccer players a year. So imagine how pathetic it is that we are sitting here all thinking about this world of changes of evidence-based based on data, and we're talking about so little money to be able to improve the capacity of countries to produce that. And the third thing is at the end of the day, I think every one of us have to come together that this is no job for every one person. It's really a collective effort that we have to take on to change this, and the incentives in the old days has been that, most of the times when we've been capacity building or training or advocating for data and so on, it's been on the production side. And we really have to go much more to the evidence and to the impact side. And we've seen a lot of times that it has worked when everybody has come together, in financial crisis, when IMF came up with with the General Data Dissemination Facility, lots of examples when people actually come together. Data from production does go to use and make an impact. In terms of do we need a new platform, a new initiative? There is a lot of us lot of actors, a lot of organizations that have been recently set up, like the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development, and others that are working towards this. But as I said, I think it's much more a collective action, and think tanks and like Brookings, organizations like the World Bank and others can really make a difference of making sure, with good examples like what Beth said, of how evidence can really change the lives or the way we do development. In that sense, I wanted to also make a pitch that right now, my group, working with a number of other groups, are collecting what we call data impact stories. Again, exactly to show the value of data. And we have several challenges, in fact, running. So if you follow my group or me on the Twitter, you'll see that those challenges. And if you do have data impact stories, please share them with us, because those are, I think, is the magic bullet for solving this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Shada. You scored with that soccer tidbit. Just a quick question. I'd like each of you to respond, very quickly, 20 seconds. And Shada got us started on it. My question was going to be on, we have acknowledged some of the shortcomings of the work that we have done. We focused really on national actors, so we don't have this information at the level of local governments, school administrators, or teachers, for example. And I said it's a small sample, and we don't quite know the whys and the hows. My question is, what do you think should be the next steps in taking this further and going deeper? Shada talked about the data impact stories that they're collecting, which sounds great. Any other thoughts? Just if you have another one, I'll have you go last. So we'll start with Nathaniel.
Many ideas, but the one I'll share right now, and this builds on one of the conclusions in the report around this seemingly latent demand that's not been met for essentially program evaluation, impact assessment data. So, one of the huge challenges, of course, one is, the effort and costs that are required to do them well, especially if you get to sort of randomized experiments or quasi-experimental approaches. This is not cheap stuff, and you're quickly into the 7 figures usually. So knowing that, I think, and again, reflecting the geographic skewing of the current work in that dimension, I think there's some interesting potential to take a sort of, what's been coined the sort of meta-keto approach from scholars in certain communities, especially in the governance community, where you can field a suite of parallel experiments and applied research, but that's aiming at a common goal line. And that helps to deal with the problems we always have with external validity, right? So even if you stroke a check for $10 million and go out and do 10 experiments, in a really rigorous way and generate a bunch of data, we often don't know if it's just about that location. And especially when so much of this gets down to the district or sub-district or school level, you run huge risks in just having really beautiful research that may or may not speak to anything else in the world. So some sort of coordinated effort where there's an intentionality behind the experiments and the research, such that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, with a modest investment, I think could be useful for maybe answering some more foundational questions, rather than just, a permanent secretary in place X, getting excited to understand one specific question here, and even if we answer it, we just don't know if it matters or if it's relevant to others.
I think it's the excitement that we're trying to create, and I think part of it lies also in sort of how we can visualize the data. I was thinking about Hans Rosling, for example, who completely transformed how we think about data more generally and statistics. And I think we need someone like that in our sector. At the moment, we feel data is kind of heavy, bureaucratic. It's in all those sort of stacks of paper or EMIS systems or whatever. So if we could make it just more exciting. And I know Brookings is working on this as well. I know Homi Karas is not here, but he just developed this poverty clock. You have these little people jumping off, and it actually shows you in real time what is going on. But I think it really matters to people. Simple, powerful visuals matter. And I say that also with some experience of how we shared our learning generation report with high-level people when President Kikwete, who is the former president of Tanzania, went around with the recommendations of our report. He each time presented what would it mean for a country to achieve the learning generation. And we had these very simple charts that showed sort of the future, actually very in line with what you found in your report as well, kind of looking forward. Very powerful. The leaders responded to that incredibly well and asked us, could we have more information on sort of that's kind of vision. So that's my first point. Secondly, I think what I would like to know more about, and I think Dion mentioned this as well, is sort of what are these processes that really integrate data in decision making. And one of the ones, and you alluded to the Tanzania example, the reason I think and why also this data had such a big impact in Tanzania was because they came up with this program called Big Results Now, and it was completely supported by top leadership, but it was a process in which data was integrated in the planning and the operationalization of the planning, and then the accountability around it. Again, President Kikwete would have open days where they would publicize through TV what education had been doing, and this was all part of sort of the excitement, but also the process that was established with a delivery unit and a sort of tracking of where things were going. So I think knowing a little more about that, and I think that's all part of the institutional question I think that you're asking, and so I think that should be in the next report. So we need another great report.
One of the tables that fascinated me in the report was the table on EMIS, where what countries valued about EMISs. And if you recall, the check marks were sort of scattered all over, except for one column, which was communicating up and down. So, I mean, the communicating up and down, to me, what that reminds me is every time you go to school, there's an EMIS chart from about 5 years ago, and you go to the ministry, and there's an EMIS chart from about 5 years ago, and that's communicating up and down. So to me, I mean, in a way, to me, my experience in countries has always been the EMIS is the biggest missed opportunity. There's a lot of money spent on it. I mean, I'll name one country, Lesotho. We wanted to do analysis about free primary education and how that played out through the system. We were going to use the EMIS data. Nobody could use the data. In fact, it was the database was so large we couldn't even copy it from one computer to another because the technology was not able to do that. It just had resided in, it was, you know, obviously it's one consultant who came, put everything in a database, and nobody else could use it for forever. You know, it's because they had decided they'll take digital photos of every school, put them in the database, and that made it unusable. So I don't know what the ask is of you as a team, but to me, thinking through carefully about, I don't know, modular approaches to EMISs that incorporate data on learning, which is typically not in an EMIS, except for maybe end-of-cycle test scores sometimes. To me, grappling with that and I mean, these are data that are national. The countries, you know, to the extent that they care about data, this is often one that a Ministry of Education would care about deeply because it's their own data that they're generating. But even so, it's often relegated. It's unusable. So to me, asking how that could be used better and making it in a way that's responsive to that variety of needs that the respondents have expressed, I think would be really helpful.
Any other thoughts?
Just one quick thought that and it's one of my dreams is that we will make measuring data use a very normal thing. You know, just like we measure our blood pressure or go on scale and, you know, weigh ourselves, we'd be very comfortable with knowing what the use of our data sets are, you know, at the national level and international level. And by the way, we are far from that. It's a taboo. Nobody wants to measure. and so on. So we're doing a little bit of research with a grant from Hewlett with AidData, and actually looking at data use and trying to convince countries to let us, there are the technologies there so that we can monitor their websites for them and sort of compare the data and see what makes people stay on a website, use databases, and so on. So measuring data use and removing that taboo is one of the things I hope would happen.
Great. We have about 10, maybe 15, no, 10 minutes for some questions from the floor. I see a gentleman back there and 2 hands up here, and that might just do it.
We operate schools in the developing world, both low-cost private and charter schools on behalf of governments. What I wanted to ask the panel was in response to some reading I'm doing right now about pushback towards randomized control trials and the extent to which they've sort of permeated the data conversation in the last few years, but also are very expensive, are unwieldy, and sometimes are not used for policy determinations after the extensive work that's done to create them. Something I've read a bit about is about minimum viable measures, both as sort of more targeted attempts to gather data that may be less expensive, that may be easier, and that also may be more targeted towards a particular solution or particular challenge being experienced. So I was wondering if anybody on the panel might comment on that. Thank you.
Can you put it? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a comment question. I've been wondering, listening to your wonderful, insightful presentations, the collection of data is not inexpensive, and maybe, yes, it costs like a 2 soccer players' salary, but the question is if the world is willing to give that money. So, and the needs in developing countries are many. So the question comes to, okay, shall I spend a lot of money collecting data that nobody is going to use, or do I need to use this money to actually help some classroom teachers and children do a better job in learning? So I wonder if we could start with a backwards design in the collection of data. For example, to get the political will of the governments and ask them, what are you going to use the data for? This is the type of data we are going to collect. So first having the intention and the purpose already decided, and then go ahead and collect the data for educational reform. And I'd love to hear your insights.
Hand up. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for your insight on data collection from your various seminal reports that you've developed and written. My name is Yvette Murphy from the Association for Childhood Education International, and my question is, could you provide some insight on the current status and potential for cross-sectoral data collection systems in shaping policy, education policy and practice, particularly for addressing the needs of the most vulnerable populations? One area may be for identification and intervention systems in early childhood development and addressing the needs of young children with disabilities. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to perhaps field the questions to send them to individuals here, and the rest can respond if you would like. Dion, do you want to take the first question on, have you heard about these minimum viable measures, and are they promising? And Shada, perhaps the question on data collection, sort of gauging demand first before you start collecting. And Nathaniel on the cross-sectoral data collection systems, but others may have something to say on that as well. And Elizabeth, anything you want to comment on?
On the RCTs, I will plead ignorance on the minimum viable measures, but what I would say is I think there's value to carefully well done RCTs, and I don't think that's going to go away. With purpose-driven, with purpose-designed data collection instruments and interventions and so on. But I think there's a lot of scope for other kinds of learning. In the World Development Report, we argue a lot for this iterative and adaptive learning that uses measures that are perhaps more routinely collected or purposefully collected, but that actually enable real-time adaptation. I would argue that there's another in-between ground, and actually I don't know if any of my colleagues here from the World Bank who work in the SIEF group, which is the group within the human development part of the World Bank that sort of sponsors a lot of impact evaluation. And there's a push to really try to use administrative data more routinely to do impact evaluations. In fact, there's a current call for proposals out there which is explicitly about only using admin data, perhaps enhanced, perhaps improved, but the idea is to not have to go through this whole process of designing instruments, fielding large-scale household surveys to learn from the implementation of programs. And can I, since I have the mic open, just on the cross-sectoral, I think there's a bigger answer to the question, but I think there's an underexploited potential for using household surveys like the UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster survey, like the World Bank's LSMS, perhaps the demographic and health surveys, to do this sort of cross-sectoral work that enables us to link measures about learning with other kinds of measures that provide a lot of useful insights. So I think that's just a space we need to be thinking about working more.
On the question on, it wouldn't be better to start from the demand side and then build the production system. In fact, that big framework right now is happening, which is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Solution. Sustainable Development Goals has been set up for that, and the countries have signed up to it, and each country is supposed to now look at that matrix, that framework of 230 indicators, and to see what do they want to do, what is their needs. They're not obliged to pick all those indicators. So that dialogue is right now happening in terms of how to match the demand with the supply. But also there's a lot of what we are trying to advocate is that there's much more involvement from the political side to be vetting this, not to leave this as a technical matter. It really is a higher level development matter that should be involving the senior management of countries.
Nathaniel?
Yeah, super quick. Actually, on the first, if I can, on the first question for 20 seconds to our colleague from Bridge, there is actually a much newer community that's emerged in the last 2 or 3 years that is really embracing this philosophy that you don't need RCTs all of the time, and there are structured and standardized ways of gathering data that are not going to always be statistically significant, but that do give us enough insight. So we have a whole practice, for example, around adaptive evaluation and adaptive learning, where we never actually, by design, get to an RCT, but there's many months of working with operators, including with, for a number of years with a Bridge competitor, Rising Academy Network in Sierra Leone, where we spent years never getting to the RCT, but doing all kinds of structured data gathering with them in classrooms to help just tweak program design and intervention design. And we're not the only ones. There are many organizations now doing this. So there is, I think we're getting to a decent balance as a community where we're not over-fetishizing RCTs, but also, as Jan said, not dismissing them. You do need them at key moments. So we sort of have an internal chart almost, a two-dimensional chart, where as the certainty of the question becomes clearer, we get more excited about spending that $1 million potentially on the RCT. When we're very uncertain, we don't want to waste that time and money. We'd rather spend 6 weeks and do a bunch of, formative observational research, kind of feel our way around the problem, and maybe 6 months later we're at a point of, pulling the trigger. On the cross-sectoral, in some ways, little to say except to echo. I think looking at DHS, LSMS, et cetera, people have bolted on these modules in the past to get at other questions that they want to finance answers for. It's a little bit brute force and expensive, but clearly there's potential there. But also just looking at where we can make use of just real life, especially where we have points of interaction with communities, especially at schools or primary health facilities and clinics, and trying, and still navigating privacy concerns and the rest, but trying to link up those data sets, much easier said than done, but there is a lot of potential there. I don't know of blockbuster examples, but I think it's a really underexplored dimension.
Yeah, I would just quickly get to the issue of the cost and the soccer players. I would say invest in the soccer players because they will save you a lot of money down the line. I think that's the thing we actually haven't maybe measured enough is if you're able to improve your data or your assessment systems, you can address inefficiencies in the education system, which we, in our report, highlighted are huge. Just capturing how many ghost teachers there are, by simply doing that, you could save a lot of money that could pay for an entire soccer team, I'm sure.
Well, thank you very much. Lisbeth had made a call for greater excitement. I think we got that in the panel today. Made a good start. And thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you.